In a room filled with arrogance and chaos, one man's words froze the nation. The hearing had already spiraled into a theater of interruptions, raised voices, and thinly veiled contempt. Reporters shuffled their notes. Cameras clicked in rapid bursts, and the air felt charged with a kind of hostility that promised nothing good. It was the sort of moment Americans had grown far too used to, where dignity seemed like a forgotten relic, placed by the cheap thrill of insult and disruption. At the center of it all sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, her posture straight, her expression calm, her voice restrained even as others tried to rattle her. She did not rise to their bait. She did not flinch. She simply held her ground. To her critics, this composure was infuriating. To her supporters, it was proof of something deeper, that Crockett carried a strength not born of ego, but of survival and principle. And then, in that very moment of noise and disrespect, Judge Reggie Walton leaned forward. The room fell quiet not because the shouting had stopped, but because his presence demanded it. His reputation carried weight. He was no partisan operator, no Twitter personality chasing clicks. He was a man who had seen enough of America's courtroom battles to know the difference between noise and truth. His voice, steady and deliberate, cut through the commotion like a gavel striking wood. He did not waste words, did not raise his tone. He simply acknowledged what so many in the room had refused to see: Jasmine Crockett's grace under fire. He highlighted the dignity she held on to while others drowned in their own arrogance. And in doing so, he flipped the script. The very chaos meant to diminish her now only magnified the power of her composure. The silence that followed was electric. Cameras swung toward Crockett, toward Walton, toward the faces of those who suddenly realized the narrative had shifted. Reporters scribbled furiously. Viewers at home sat up straighter. Something rare had happened. Respect had entered the room. But the way the media responded next would leave even Crockett's critics speechless. The moment Judge Walton's words echoed through the chamber, it was clear this wasn't just another tense exchange in Washington. It was something mar a pause in a political climate that had grown increasingly hostile, where voices shouted over one another not to be heard but to dominate. For years, public discourse had been corroding under the weight of insult politics, where mockery replaced arguments and personal attacks drowned out ideas. Americans had come to expect chaos from their leaders, to brace themselves for viral clips filled with venom rather than vision. This was the backdrop into which Jasmine Crockett walked, a congresswoman navigating a world that often seemed eager to caricature her before she could even speak. She faced not only the ordinary challenges of governance, but the extraordinary weight of identity. For every policy she championed, for every word she spoke, there were critics waiting to dismiss her not for substance, but for who she was. And yet she refused to mirror their disrespect. She answered with calm, with clarity, with the unshakable grace that had carried her through every chapter of her life. That's what made Judge Walton's recognition so powerful. He was not a partisan cheerleader. He was not seeking attention. He was a federal judge with a record of cutting through pretense, a man who had presided over cases that tested the very fabric of American law. When he spoke, people listened. And on that day, he chose not to spotlight the loudest voice or the most abrasive soundbite. He chose to highlight dignity. In a culture obsessed with outrage, he elevated composure as the greater strength. The stakes could not have been higher. In an America growing weary of the noise, Crockett's ability to maintain poise in the middle of a storm became more than personal. It became symbolic. Her composure was not just for herself. It stood for every person who had ever been told to sit down, to be quiet, to endure insult without recognition. Walton's words validated not just Crockett, but the millions watching who longed to see. Integrity acknowledged in a time when mockery seemed to rule, and make no mistake, the contrast was striking. Round her, colleagues and critics alike had resorted to snide remarks, raised voices, and dismissive gestures. Their tactics were meant to belittle her, to drag her into the same mud they thrived in. She never joined them. The more they clawed for dominance, the more her composure revealed their insecurity. Walton saw it. America saw it. And once he named it, there was no turning back. It was as if his words drew a line in the sand. On one side, the noise, other integrity. For those listening, it felt like a reckoning, a reminder that politics did not have to sink into endless toxicity. That dignity, when held with conviction, could still command respect even from those who least wanted to give. The cameras captured every second, and the footage began to spread even before the hearing was over. This was no longer confined to one room. It was becoming a story that resonated far beyond Capitol Hill, one that Americans of every background could see themselves in. Crockett's grace was not just acknowledged, it was amplified, and as the cameras rolled, the moment became bigger than anyone in that room. Long before Judge Walton's words echoed across the chamber, Jasmine Crockett's name had already been circulating in the echo chambers of political punditry, but not with the respect it deserved. To her critics, she was an easy target, someone they believed they could reduce with snide remarks and shallow stereotypes. They saw her youth, her sharp tongue, her identity as a black woman in politics, and mistook those qualities for weakness. They turned her into a caricature, mocking her with headlines designed to entertain rather than inform. Cable news panels laughed as commentators dismissed her as too emotional, as too radical, or just another loud voice from the left. They clipped her speeches into bite-sized sound bites stripped of context, played not to showcase her arguments, but to provoke outrage in their viewers. Social media trolls, emboldened by the nightly monologues of partisan hosts, piled on with the usual recycled insults. And in the halls of Congress, rivals whispered and sneered. Convinced that their interruptions and raised voices would keep her small, it was arrogance masquerading as authority, kind of arrogance that thrives in the chaos of modern politics, where the loudest insult often drowns out the clearest truth. These critics built their brands not by offering solutions, but by tearing down those who dared to speak differently. They thrived on division, stoking anger because anger kept audiences hooked. For them, Crockett was not a colleague or even an opponent. She was a convenient foil, someone whose very presence challenged their comfort zones. But arrogance has a pattern, and Crockett had seen it before. The same pattern appeared every time she faced dismissive tones in courtrooms, every time she walked into political spaces that doubted her, every time she stood in front of a microphone knowing her words would be twisted before they even reached the public. She learned to expect the mockery. More importantly, she learned how to outlast it. Her critics underestimated her because they assumed politics was only about who could speak the loudest. They did not see the preparation, the discipline, the quiet resolve that Crockett carried. With her, while they scrambled for headlines, she built a foundation of resilience. While they rehearsed their insults, she sharpened her understanding of the law, her command of history, ability to connect policy to lived experience. And while they plotted their ambushes, she prepared for storms with the patience of someone who knew storms never last. The irony was clear to anyone paying attention. The very arrogance meant to diminish her only revealed their weakness. Her voice, they revealed their fear of what it carried. When they belittled her presence, they exposed how much it unsettled them. Every dismissive gesture, every cheap shot, every attempt to turn her into a punchline became part of a larger contrast between those who thrived on chaos and the woman who refused to be broken by it. And it wasn't just in Congress. Across the media landscape, her critics doubled down. Opinion writers dismissed her as a performer. Late-night clips turned her patience into memes, meant to belittle rather than celebrate. Pundits debated her tone more than her arguments, a coded critique that echoed the way women, especially women of color, are so often judged. Yet even in this atmosphere, Crockett did not mirror their disrespect. She absorbed it, reframed it, and carried herself with the steadiness of someone who knew she was building something larger than a news cycle. That is why Judge Walton's words mattered so much. They did not emerge in a vacuum, landed against a backdrop of years of mockery, years of arrogance, years of attempts to define Crockett by the limits of her critics' imagination. His recognition was not just about one moment in a hearing room, it was about every moment where she had been denied respect. Every instance where arrogance had tried to strip dignity from her work. Her antagonists believed their chaos would always win. They believed dignity was weakness and noise was power. But the truth, as Walton made clear, was exactly the opposite. Crockett's composure exposed their fragility. Her grace revealed their desperation. And when the cameras captured the judge, affirming her presence, the arrogance that once seemed untouchable suddenly looked small, petty, and transparent. But arrogance always forgets one truth. Dignity is its own weapon, To understand why Judge Walton's words resonated so powerfully, you have to step back and see Jasmine Crockett not as a single moment, but as a journey. She was never the kind of figure who arrived in politics by accident or by privilege. Carved her way in through grit, persistence, and a conviction that the law, despite its flaws, could be used to defend those who had long been denied justice. Before Congress, before the cameras, before the headlines, Crockett was an attorney who took cases most others would not. She represented people who had been ignored, who could not afford polished legal teams, who needed someone willing to stand in court and say, their voices matter too. It wasn't glamorous work. It didn't bring in the high-alert retainers or television spots. But it shaped her. Day after day, she watched how power was used against the powerless, how the system bent hardest on those least able to push back. Day after day, she stood up anyway. Those courtrooms became her training ground. Every raised eyebrow from a judge, every dismissive sigh from opposing counsel. Every time someone tried to reduce her presence to a stereotype, taught her patience. It taught her how to fight without losing herself. For a black woman in law, composure wasn't optional. It was armor. She had to master the art of making her arguments sharper than the prejudice in the room, of keeping her tone steady even. When others sought to provoke, the law could be hostile territory, but Crockett learned to navigate it with discipline. Activism, too, shaped her resilience. Long before her congressional seat, she was on the front lines of protests and community organizing. She understood what it meant to demand accountability from systems that refused to give it freely. She saw friends and neighbors underestimated, written off, and talked over. And she absorbed the lesson that silence in the face of injustice only strengthens the oppressor. Her decision to step into politics wasn't about ambition. It was about service. It was about carrying those voices with her into the halls of power. But even as she entered Congress, the old barriers followed her. Racism did not disappear. Sexism did not soften. Instead, they intensified under brighter lights. The media framed her as fiery when a white male colleague would have been called passionate. Her directness was painted as anger, her advocacy as radicalism. She was subjected to the coded language every woman of color in public life knows, to well the quiet attempt to shrink her into a stereotype rather than acknowledge her substance. Still, she refused to shrink. Each insult, each attempt to caricature her only strengthened her resolve. She learned to let the labels bounce off while she doubled down on what she knew best, speaking truth with composure. Where others saw hostility, she saw confirmation of why her presence mattered. Every attack meant she was touching a nerve. Every dismissal meant she was challenging a comfort zone. The hostility wasn't limited to media spin. In congressional hearings, rivals interrupted her, tried to talk over her, dismissed her expertise. They treated her presence as if it were a disruption rather than an addition to the conversation. But instead of trading insult for insult, she honed a different strategy. She let their disrespect expose them. And when it was her turn to speak, she delivered with precision. Calm, deliberate, unshaken. It is this composure, forged in years of struggle, that made Judge Walton's recognition so electrifying. He wasn't just pointing to one moment of grace. He was acknowledging the long history of battles that had trained her for it. He was acknowledging the woman who had stood in hostile courtrooms, the activist who had braved dismissive headlines, the congresswoman who had absorbed insults without flinching. His words carried the weight of validation, not just for that day, but for every day she had endured without acknowledgement. That is why supporters saw themselves in her. For immigrants, for women, for anyone who had ever been told to stay quiet. Crockett represented the possibility of turning resilience into respect. Her story reminded them that composure is not passivity, it is power. It is the refusal to let others define your narrative, and it is the confidence that truth, when held with dignity, eventually speaks louder than insult. Crockett's journey was not defined by shortcuts or easy victories. It was defined by endurance. By walking into rooms where she was not expected, to belong and making herself undeniable. By carrying the weight of identity in spaces designed to overlook it and turning that weight into fuel, every step, every challenge, every headline sharpened her. So when Judge Walton leaned forward and spoke, it wasn't just about a single exchange in a crowded chamber. It was the culmination of everything she had built. Every courtroom where she stood alone. Every protest where she raised her voice. Every headline that mocked her instead of hearing her. Walton's recognition was the mirror of her journey, reflecting back the truth that had been there all along. Dignity held steady always outlasts arrogance. Every challenge she endured had prepared her for this exact moment of recognition. The chamber had grown restless, its atmosphere thick with impatience and friction. What began as a hearing intended to examine issues of national consequence had devolved, predictably, into a performance stage for those who thrived on sound bites. Rival lawmakers leaned into their microphones, their voices raised not to persuade, but to dominate. Each interruption grew sharper, each dismissal more cutting, until the dialogue was less about ideas and more about proving who could sneer the loudest. Reporters in the back row exchanged glances as their pens scribbled across notepads. This was the chaos they had come to expect, the kind of disorder that fed headlines but drained public trust. On the screens carried live across the nation, viewers watched a familiar spectacle, one side escalating its aggression, the other left. To weather the storm, and at the center of it all, was Jasmine Crockett. She sat upright, hands folded, her eyes trained steadily on the speaker across from her. She did not lean forward in anger, nor did she retreat in discomfort. Instead, she held her position with a quiet resolve that made the noise around her seem all the more desperate. While others jostled for attention, she let them reveal themselves in their haste. Her composure was not silence, it was strategy. Antagonists, growing bolder with each outburst, mistook her stillness for weakness. One interrupted her mid-sentence, raising his voice as if volume could substitute for logic. Another rolled his eyes, muttering dismissive remarks meant to belittle rather than engage. They piled on, their rhythm accelerating like a storm tightening. Its spiral. Yet the more they pressed, the less they seemed in control. Their frustration seeped through, their arrogance no longer masked but laid bare for all to see. Crockett, however, gave them nothing. She let the interruptions fall into the air unacknowledged. She listened without flinching, without matching their tone. Each time she began to speak, only to be cut off, she simply paused, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged. The restraint was deliberate. She knew that responding with equal fire would grant her critics exactly what they wanted, a spectacle, where they could claim parody. Instead, she gave them a mirror. And in that mirror, their behavior looked small. The tension thickened as minutes passed. Cameras zoomed in on Crockett's face, capturing her restraint in close detail. Commentators watching live scribbled notes for their post-hearing reactions. Even viewers at home could sense the imbalance, one side spiraling into hostility, the other anchored in grace. It was the kind of moment that tested not just patience but principle. Then came the breaking point. A rival, his tone dripping with disdain, attempted yet another interruption. He dismissed her argument outright, waving his hand as though her presence itself was unworthy of the chamber's time. It was the culmination of every tactic they had used against her mockery. Dismissal arrogance all condensed into a single gesture. The air seemed to tighten. For a brief second, it felt as though the chamber itself held its breath, waiting to see if this would finally provoke her. But it didn't. Crockett remained motionless, her posture firm, her silence more cutting than any rebuttal she could have given. The cameras caught at the calm that made the aggression beside her look unhinged. Her stillness was louder than their shouting. And in that silence, the imbalance of dignity versus chaos became undeniable. And then, a voice cut through the storm. A voice no one dared ignore. The chamber was a storm voices overlapping. Insults colliding, tensions spiraling upward. Then came the shift. Judge Reggie Walton leaned forward, his presence commanding attention before a word even left his lips. The air itself seemed to stiffen, as though it understood something weighty was about to be delivered. His reputation was not one of theatrics or partisanship. He was known for precision, for gravity, for words that carried consequence. And so when his voice finally broke the noise, it landed not as suggestion but as verdict. Congresswoman Crockett has conducted herself with dignity, Walton said, each syllable deliberate, steady, final. The room froze. It was not just what he said, it was the tone, the authority, the unmistakable recognition of grace amid chaos. Those words hit harder than any raised voice, sharper than any insult hurled moments before. They struck like a gavel. In a courtroom, commanding silence, demanding reflection. For a breathless pause, even the cameras seemed to hesitate. Their worries softened, as if giving space for the words to sink in. Reporters glanced up from their notes. Pens stalled mid-sentence. The clamor that had defined the hearing evaporated into stunned quiet. Faces turned, first toward Walton, then toward Crockett, as though the nation's eyes were following the pivot of power in real time. For so long, critics had painted her as noise. Now, the most respected voice in the room had redefined her as grace. Camera flashes erupted, one after another, illuminating Crockett's face like bursts of lightning. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She did not even break her posture. Instead, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, her expression calm, her presence unchanged. That restraint was its own triumph, told the room and everyone watching that she did not need to revel in validation. The validation spoke for itself. The antagonists shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One adjusted his tie. Another leaned back with an expression that tried to mask discomfort but failed. Their arrogance, once loud and unyielding, now looked brittle under the spotlight Walton had redirected. The louder they had been, the smaller they seemed now. Every interruption they had made, every dismissive smirk, was suddenly reframed, not as power plays, but as evidence of insecurity. Walton, for his part, did not extend his words into a lecture. He did not need to. That one line carried more weight than paragraphs of analysis ever could. He had given Crockett what her critics had long denied her. Not permission, not charity, but recognition. Recognition of her poise. Recognition of her strength. Recognition of the dignity she had held, even when others had sought to strip it away. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full. Full of realization, full of recalibration, full of the quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted. Viewers at home leaned forward, replaying the words in their minds. Journalists in the chamber scribbled furiously now, aware that they had just witnessed the headline moment in Crockett. She remained composed, letting the silence do the talking, letting the weight of Walton's recognition reverberate far beyond anything she could add. It was cinematic, it's almost theatrical, but it was not performance, it was truth unveiled. For so long, the narrative had been tilted by arrogance and amplified by noise. But in that instant, truth cut through like a blade, clean and undeniable. Walton had not spoken as an ally or as an opponent. He had spoken as a witness to dignity, and his voice carried the moral authority that arrogance could not drown out. For the antagonists, there was nowhere to go. To push back would have made them look desperate. To remain silent was to admit defeat. So they sat there, shrinking by the second, their bluster reduced to background static against the gravity of Walton's words. Even the dismissive pundits, who had built careers mocking Crockett, would find it hard to spin this moment into ridicule. When a federal judge praised her grace in front of the nation, mockery became hollow. Meanwhile, Crockett's composure became the story. Not because she demanded it, but because she embodied it. Her restraint turned Walton's words into something larger than a compliment. They became a mirror reflecting everything she had endured, everything she had chosen not to mirror in return. She had never needed to raise her voice, never needed to hurl insults, never needed to descend into the mud. She had chosen grace, and now grace had chosen her. The chamber felt different now. Where moments earlier it had been thick with hostility, it now carried an uneasy calm. People shifted in their chairs, their movements softer, their tones subdued. The hierarchy of power had been reset, not by shouting, but by acknowledgement. For Crockett supporters watching, it was validation long overdue. For those who doubted her, it was a reminder that dignity cannot be dismissed when recognized by authority. The flashes continued. The coverage already being packaged for replay on cable networks, TikTok clips, and Twitter threads. Soon watch those few seconds of silence after Walton's declaration. They would see Crockett's nod, her steady presence, her refusal to break composure even in vindication. They would see arrogance collapse under its own weight. And they would feel something rare in modern politics: respect. The villains of the story had not been shouted down, had not been insulted into silence. They had been revealed. Their tactics had been stripped of their power because dignity had exposed them for what they were: petty distractions, unable to withstand grace. For Jasmine Crockett was never about a single moment of triumph. It was about what that moment represented, that resilience can outlast ridicule, that composure can outshine chaos, and that dignity, once recognized, becomes undeniable. She did not raise her hand in victory, did not offer a celebratory retort. She sat quietly, letting the silence expand. Knowing that the message had already been delivered more powerfully than words could manage, and as the chamber slowly exhaled, as the antagonists shifted and the cameras rolled, it became clear that this was no ordinary exchange. It was a turning point, a mic drop not of noise, but of stillness. A declaration not of defiance, but of dignity, the ripple effect outside. Those walls was immediate and unstoppable. The words had barely settled in the chamber when the effect began. Cameras caught every flicker of expression, every uneasy shift from the antagonists, every steady breath from Jasmine Crockett. Within minutes, those images and Walton's statement were flashing across television screens. News tickers in the timelines of millions of Americans, cable networks cut into regular programming with the headline, "Judge Walton praises Crockett's grace in tense hearing." Anchors replayed the clip on loop, marveling at the silence that followed, the rare moment when arrogance gave way to dignity. Twitter exploded with hashtags, #GraceUnderFire, #Crockett moment, #Walton said it. Clips of Walton's declaration were edited with dramatic music, slowed down for emphasis, turned into instant TikTok trends. Young creators stitched the footage with captions, "This is how you carry yourself when the world wants you to crack." What was striking wasn't just who shared it, but how. Commentators who had often been critical of Crockett found themselves nodding in reluctant respect. One conservative pundit admitted on air, "You don't have to agree with her politics to admit she handled that with more poise than anyone else in the room." Another, who had previously mocked her speeches, tweeted simply, "Respect where it's due." That acknowledgement, rare in a climate built on division, underscored the depth of the moment. Progressive commentators, meanwhile, seized the opportunity to contrast Crockett's composure with the behavior of her rivals. "This," one anchor said, pausing after the replay of Walton's words, "is the difference between leadership and spectacle." Editorial columns quickly followed, framing the exchange as symbolic of America's larger crossroads: dignity versus chaos, truth versus noise, grace versus arrogance. But the media alone didn't define the moment. Ordinary Americans did. The clip spread through group chats, Facebook posts, and community forums. Teachers shared it with students as an example of composure under pressure. Parents showed it to their children, describing it as a model of how to respond when others try to belittle you. "This," one viral tweet read, "is what leadership looks like." In living rooms across the country, people who rarely watched congressional hearings found themselves rewinding the clip, showing it again and again. It became less about politics and more about humanity, about the universal longing to see dignity recognized in a world too often consumed by mockery. People saw Crockett's nod, her refusal to gloat, and they felt something they hadn't expected to feel from politics: inspiration. Even memes that circulated captured the shift. On one side of a split-screen image, her rivals, red-faced and shouting. On the other, Crockett, composed with Walton's words captioned beneath. The contrast required no commentary. The image spoke volumes. What gave the moment staying power was how it resonated across identities. For Black women, it was validation against a lifetime of being stereotyped as angry or unfit. For immigrants, it was a reminder that grace can triumph even in hostile spaces. For young activists, it was proof that integrity could still break through the noise. Each group claimed the moment as their own, yet it belonged to everyone who believed dignity deserved a place in public. Life, the antagonists, by contrast, had little ground left to stand on. Their attempts to spin the hearing as business as usual fell flat. Clips of their dismissive gestures played alongside Walton's recognition, making them look smaller, meaner, out of step with the dignity the public now demanded. Their silence, in the aftermath, told its own story. Arrogance, when exposed, has no defense. Crockett herself said little. She did not rush to Twitter with a victory lap. She did not flood interviews with gloating remarks. Instead, she maintained the same composure she had shown in the chamber, letting others do the talking. That restraint only amplified her stature. The less she said, the more the public filled in the blanks with admiration. In the span of hours, a single line had transformed from a courtroom observation into a cultural moment. It had become the lens through which millions judged the state of American politics, and the lens through which they found hope that dignity could still prevail. But the real meaning of this moment reached far beyond one headline. In the days that followed, the noise of politics, the insults, the posturing, the endless chase for viral outrage did not vanish. But for once, it was drowned out by something stronger. Judge Reggie Walton's words had done more than honor. One congresswoman. They had reframed what leadership could look like in an era defined by division. In a chamber designed for debate but too often consumed by derision, dignity had won the day. The moral was undeniable. Grace outshines arrogance. The contrast had been on full display. One side relied on mockery, gears, and attempts to rattle their opponent. The other held steady, refusing to mirror their chaos. And when the dust settled, it wasn't the loudest voice that commanded respect. It was the calmest. Crockett's composure had not only protected her from insult, it had elevated her above it. In that moment, she became more than a participant in the hearing. She became a symbol. For those who had watched her endure interruption after interruption, the recognition felt personal. When Walton named her Grace, he named the dignity of every person who had been talked over, dismissed, or demeaned simply for existing. Crockett's nod, her silence, her refusal to gloat, these gestures transformed the personal into the universal. She wasn't just defending herself, she was carrying a truth larger than herself. Walton's recognition carried equal weight. As a judge, his reputation was built on impartiality, on cutting through the noise to uphold principle. His acknowledgement was not a partisan endorsement. It was a cultural elevation. By honoring Crockett's dignity, he elevated the very idea of composure as a political strength. His words reminded the nation that true authority does not belong to the loudest or most arrogant. It belongs to those who can rise above the storm with integrity intact. And the effect was contagious. In classrooms, students discussed the clip as an example of how to respond to adversity. In workplaces, colleagues shared it as a reminder that respect is not weakness but power. Families passed it around at dinner tables, pointing to Crockett's steady nod and saying, "That's how you carry yourself." Respect, once modeled, became a standard others wanted to meet. Dignity, once recognized, began to feel like a cultural shift waiting to happen. The lesson stretched beyond politics. It was about life itself. Arrogance may draw headlines, but it cannot inspire. Mockery may grab attention, but it cannot sustain admiration. What lasts, what resonates, what ripples outward, is grace. Crockett had shown it, Walton had recognized it, and now millions carried it forward. This wasn't just Crockett's victory, it was a victory for every voice, silenced by arrogance. It was a reminder that dignity is not passive, it is active. Resistance to strength disguised as stillness, power wrapped in restraint. And when dignity is finally seen, It has the ability to change not only a moment, but the culture around it. That is the legacy of what happened in that chamber. A reminder that in the battle between arrogance and grace, dignity is its own weapon and, ultimately, its own triumph. Judge Reggie Walton's words cut through the noise with the force of truth. Jasmine Crockett had carried herself with grace. That single recognition shifted the entire room, and soon the entire media followed. From television anchors to TikTok creators, from seasoned commentators to ordinary Americans around kitchen tables, the story was the same. In a political climate too often poisoned by arrogance and chaos, dignity stood tall. The nation noticed this was never just about one exchange or one headline. It was about what kind of leadership we choose to value. Crockett didn't need to shout, didn't need to strike back, didn't need to play the game of mockery. She showed that composure is not weakness, it's strength. And Walton, with his reputation for fairness, amplified that truth for all to hear. The moral clarity is simple but profound. Dignity will always outweigh chaos. Grace will always silence arrogance. And when we elevate leaders who embody these values, we raise the standard for everyone. But moments like these are not meant to fade into yesterday's news cycle. They are reminders that the culture can shift, that respect can ripple outward, that each of us has a part to play in amplifying what matters. So here's the call. If you believe respect must always rise above arrogance, if you believe dignity is worth defending in our politics and in our lives, then don't let this moment end here. Share this story. Subscribe to this channel and join the movement of voices who know that true leadership is not about who shouts the loudest, but about who stands the tallest when it matters most.